death. Death is something inescapable. It's reality. It seems so permanent. You can't escape it. I can't escape it. No one can. We can try to shut it out, to close our eyes from it and move it happening into places that we don't have to visit, but nevertheless, it happens. To the strong and mighty, to the weak and lowly, to the rich, to the poor, to the kings and queens, to the man from the street. The reality of death is just as sure today as it was a good 3,000 years back. Saul and Jonathan had died, and new King David was filled with grief. Immediately in the first chapter of second book of Samuel, we read this detailed description of how Saul and Jonathan had died, and it's almost too horrifying to read and to imagine, and it makes you actually want to stop reading because it's so horrible. But that story ends with a song. It ends with a song that David sings. It's such an outburst of emotion, and it makes you stop and think about the reality of death. It's a beautiful poem. Hebrew poetry is beautiful. There are word pairs and other poetical elements like the way the lines, the columns have been ordered into sets of 2 or 3, and they are repeating the thought from the previous line. A little bit like this. Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice. The daughters of the uncircumcised will exalt. See? There's like repetition or even parallelism between the different lines. Like the one line is saying something, and then the next one is like repeating it, but just with a little bit different words. Now, this is something really typical in the biblical Hebrew poetry. And this poem, it talks about how even the nature is grieving. The mountains where the men had died, even they should be in a state of sorrow because of this horrible death. And it's rather strange that even though the situation there was completely different than what most of us are living at the moment, and there's like thousands of years in between, and still the grieving and the longing and the desperate feeling of death, it remains to be something so universal. I mean, this poem, it describes the heroes of the war. That's the idea of it. David sings of both men, Saul and Jonathan. And while Saul is being praised as this fantastic king and warrior in all possible ways, yet the bottom line is that the song seems to be somehow still more about Jonathan than Saul. My brother Jonathan. Even the title of the song seems to be referring to Jonathan. The song is called a bow, or the Song of the Bow. Like some add to it, but a bow. I mean, isn't that a little weird name for a song? Why should the song be called a bow? Actually, the poem, it talks about a bow. In verse 22, it talks about the bow, which was the weapon of, well, Jonathan. Not Saul, but Jonathan. Remember? It was Jonathan who shot those 3 bows in order to show David the sign, to warn him that Saul wanted to get him killed. Jonathan was an archer. The bow was Jonathan's tool. So in this song, Saul, the king, he's being praised and he gets lots of recognition, but the real receiver of the song is the bow. The one of whom we hear in verse 26 those famous words. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. The pain of David is tangible. It's grief, it's depression, it's distress. My brother Jonathan. See? Saul is described with facts. This is how good of a warrior he was, or this is how much gold he gave to you as a present, or something like that. But Jonathan is described with emotion. My brother Jonathan. Was he really David's brother? Well, no, not biologically. He was David's brother-in-law in reality, but I don't think that that's what David is talking about here. He's using the Hebrew word brother in a broader sense, as a member of the tribe, a fellow member of the community, as a companion, as a friend. And I guess that's why it is so easy to identify with the way David grieves for him. It doesn't have to be a relative or a sibling that you've lost. This applies to anyone who was dear to you, anyone special who you loved. It's a universal emotion. Now, some have claimed that the way David talks about Jonathan here is in fact a homosexual expression, and I can see how someone could read this text in that way. I mean, greatly beloved were you to me, your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. I get it. But let's just stop here to think about the word love. Now, the Hebrew word for love here is called ahava, and of course it can describe the love between spouses. But at the same time, it doesn't have to be anything romantic or erotic kind of love. We have many examples of it in the Old Testament that use this word for friendship, or even the love that God shows to humans, and we wouldn't call that somehow romantic or erotic. I mean, the word is used in a much wider sense of love. I mean, like in English, you can love your parents, you can love your children, your friends, your jeans, your dog even. I mean, it doesn't have to be romantic. And yeah, I mean, even men can be friends and love each other, even if we would feel uncomfortable expressing it like that in our culture and time. But mostly I think that the way David says in Hebrew that the love from Jonathan was more, it was different than, it was somehow other than the love of women. Well, this exactly expresses that it was not a romantic kind of love. Not on that level like the love between David and all his wives, which he had many, and which he really liked. Just think of the example of the situation with Bathsheba, for example. And of course, Jonathan also had a wife and a son. Yeah, no, I don't think that this text tells us anything about homosexuality, really. Rather, I think it talks about something bigger, something broader, something more universal, something more, yeah, different than that kind of definitions. Rather, it's about companionship, about a deep friendship, or a shared understanding, about saving the other one's life, about endangering your own in order to do that, about an understanding of the hearts. I mean, that exceeds romance or sexuality. That's what David is trying to say in verse 26, I think. And it's about that deep loss of a friend, of another human being who was there for you, who understood you, who took care of you, who was, well, like a family, like a brother. That's what David is grieving. The whole song is about what wonderful warriors the two men were. But regardless, the same reality of life and death had come to them just the same. In verse 23, David uses words like faster and superior when he compares the two men to wild animals. But you know what? Ecclesiastes 9 verses 11 uses exactly the same words when it says that under the sun, the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to the skillful. But time and chance happen to them all. It doesn't matter if you're strong and swift. Time and chance happen to us all. Everybody dies. That's reality. That's human reality. And this is something that I really admire about the Bible, that it's so real, that it's so human. It resonates with my experience about life. I mean, even though the context is totally different than mine, but the human experience, it's the same. I read it and I feel the pain of David from 3,000 years ago. It's real. It's life. That's why it's relevant. Culture and context, they change. Years pass by, but the core, it stays the same. The core of the story of the whole Bible for us humans, about this life and this journey here, it stays the same. That's why it's relevant. Even now, in 2016, we are still living the same life. We're still faced with the same issues, with the same questions about life and death, about love and hate, about eternity or destruction, the purpose of life. That's why it's still relevant. It still resonates in our human experience of life. It still resonates. My brother, Jonathan.